Welcome to the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show. Presented by the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association. Now here's your Garden Show host, Dr. Bob Shutzke.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show, brought to you by the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association. I am Dr. Bob, your host for the 2021 gardening season. Tune in every Saturday at 4 p.m. through August. We will share garden insights, feature guests from Michigan's green industry, and answer your questions submitted through PlantMichiganGreen.com Ask the Expert. Our hope is to make the most of your outdoor living experience. During the week, you can log on to PlantMichiganGreen.com, your landscaping and horticulture resource, to pose gardening questions, find a professional horticulturist, locate a retail garden center in your area, or become aware of the rewarding careers in Michigan's green industry. We will spend today's show with Dr. Bert Cregg from the Departments of Horticulture and Forestry at Michigan State University. He will be with us after a short break, so stick around and get into the gardening groove on the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show on News Talk 760 WJR. Welcome back. We're pleased to have Dr. Bert Cregg of Michigan State University to talk about trees and a bunch more. Hi, Bert.
Hey, Bob.
How are you?
Doing well, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show. What useful information about trees can you share with our listeners today?
Well, one of the big things we like to talk about with trees is really trying to head off problems before they start. So oftentimes we get calls about trees that are not performing well or even dying and things like this. And sometimes it's things that maybe couldn't have been prevented, storms that we've had and these types of things. But oftentimes we see problems that are really related to not getting the right tree in the right place. And it's kind of a mantra we have in horticulture, right tree, right place. But really thinking about what that means and getting that tree in the spot where it needs to be. And oftentimes that really starts with things like site evaluation. So for people to really understand their site, and before they even think about planting a tree, really looking at the site and analyzing what the needs are out there.
What are some of those specific site characteristics that you would like them to look at?
So a really important one and often overlooked is drainage. And so oftentimes what we see is that for some things, and we'll talk about soil pH and things like that, if it's not quite right, the tree maybe goes into a slow decline, things like this. But with flooding or poor drainage, it can often be a yes-no. And so trees that are not adapted to wet sites, if you plant them in an area that's wet, they'll often fail maybe right out of the gate. And so right now is actually a pretty good time to do this. So most of the state, at least the lower part of Michigan, if you look around, we've had 5, 6, 7 inches of rain in some places in the past week. So now is a good time for people to go around, maybe make some mental notes of where's water ponding in your yard, and then that's spots where you may want to avoid certain species, things like oaks perhaps, or conifers, some things that don't tolerate wet feet. Make notes of those areas so that you avoid that and don't put in plants that don't like wet spots. I've got an area in my yard for years. Every time we'd have the spring snow melt or the early rains, I'd have to mow around this area because it would always pond. And so what I finally did is I put a bald cypress in there. There's a species that likes wet feet, and that tree is now probably 20 feet tall and is enjoying life. And so you can avoid those problems, identify your wet spots and avoid putting in those plants that aren't going to tolerate those kind of situations.
Quite often people are told that if you have a wet spot, you can plant the plant higher. Does that really work?
It can, but it's really better, I think, to try to find the species that's gonna fit that spot. So right tree, right place. I have kind of a corollary to that is don't fight the site. So in other words, if you know that area is wet, you might be able to forestall some problems by planting it high, but really the better longer term solution is, let's just avoid, the species we know don't tolerate those wet sites and just keep them out of there to begin with.
Yeah. What about breaking through the bottom of the pit? Because sometimes we hear people talking about putting in a French drain or digging a hole deeper and putting some gravel in there or something like that, so the excess water drains through the actual planting hole.
Yeah, that's pretty tough. Usually, if we're really have an area where water tends to pond, it's really more of a it becomes almost more of an engineering kind of problem there to really get that water away from that location. Again, I think getting the right tree in there is probably a better longer term solution. Some of these other things may give you some benefit in the short term, but longer term, again, don't fight the site, unless you want to get into major engineering kinds of solutions. You're probably better off just finding something that's going to fit in that location, because there's usually going to be lots of choices that you could put in there.
Yeah, a lot easier that way too.
Yep. Yeah. And then, on to other site factors. So the drainage is the big one, again, just because it tends to be kind of a yes-no thing. Another thing we see oftentimes is soil pH. And this is one where if it's off a little bit, the tree may go into a slow decline. So we know that. So, kind of back things up a little bit, high school chemistry, we know that pH is the relative acidity of a soil. And so most plants, trees included, right around a pH of 6.5, so slightly on the acidic side of neutral is sort of optimum. And again, if we don't know anything about a plant, we would probably say 6.5 is sort of the target pH. There are certain trees and popular ones that often will not do well if we get much above that. And so I'm thinking about things like red maples, pin oaks, even a lot of conifers. When we get above 7, certainly, and sometimes even a little bit below 7, those particular plants will show stress. Particularly, they'll get yellowish, chlorotic, that type of thing. And so knowing ahead of time what your pH is, if you do a soil test and you find out that your pH is 7.5, well, those are going to be poor choices, right? And yes, we can do some things. You can add sulfur. You can do some things to drop the pH. But again, those are sort of temporary or stopgap kind of things, because the pH is going to drift back up over time. And so why not just plant something that we know is going to do well there, an elm, a linden. There are things that will tolerate the higher pH, hackberry. There are things that are going to tolerate that pH. So again, rather than fight the site and try to amend things and try to drop that pH, let's just plant something that's going to tolerate that pH from the get-go.
Yeah, it's a good point. In fact, if a person's curious about the pH of their soils, there are many garden centers will test the pH for you, or you can buy a pH test kit, and those test kits will get you in the ballpark of what your soil pH is.
Right, exactly. The other thing is MSU Extension also has a program. It's a self-mailer, and so if you just Google MSU soil test or MSU soil test self-mailer, there is actually a program where you can sign on. You do it online, and they'll send you a little mailer, a little box, and then you can return that to the MSU Soils Lab, and it will give you an output with some of your basic soil nutrition information, but it also includes the soil pH, so it's an easy way to do it. But really having that starting information is key to getting the right tree in the right place.
Bert, we need to take a short break right now. Stay tuned for more from Dr. Bert Cregg and the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show on Newstalk 760 WJR.
Welcome back to more of the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show with your host, Dr. Bob Shutzke.
Welcome back. We're here with Dr. Bert Cregg from the Departments of Horticulture and Forestry at Michigan State University. We've been talking about trees and right plant, right place. So let's continue, Bert. What else can you tell us about right plant, right place when it comes to planting and selecting trees?
Yeah, so a couple of other big items. One is exposure. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about the amount of light that a tree can get. And one of the things we find is that certain trees are what we would call pioneer species, or from a successional kind of point of view, that tend to grow in more open areas and need a lot of sunlight. And so those types of trees, those that need a lot of light, foresters would call it shade intolerant, are just that. They won't do well in shady areas. And so looking at, do I have full sun? Do I have part sun? Am I completely in the shade? There's a lot of trees that just won't do well if they are in complete shade. A lot of conifers typically won't do well if they're in full shade. And so knowing that part of the landscape and getting a good idea of the exposure is going to be an important thing. And so as you're assessing the site, that's going to be a key consideration. So when you go to the garden center, probably one of the first things the people are going to ask you when you're saying, okay, I'm looking for a tree for my yard, is going to be, what's the exposure? So get some information on that so that you can get, if it's a shady area in particular, something that's going to tolerate those conditions. Maybe a beech, maybe a hemlock. Those are the kind of things that are going to do better in those shady locations, because the trees that are not shade adapted are really going to struggle if you put them in that environment.
Yeah, and generally speaking, we usually consider 6 hours of sunlight as being full sun.
Right. Yeah, they need at least probably half the day, the afternoon or the morning to get that exposure. Anything less than that, and trees that need a lot of light are gonna struggle.
Yeah. What about temperature? Do we have to be concerned? We hear about climate change and global warming. Should we be concerned about cold hardiness or heat tolerance?
Yeah, so when we, looking at it first from the cold end of things, certainly we want to pay attention to our hardiness zone. So again, if you want to Google USD hardiness zone, that's how we classify the cold tolerance of trees and other garden plants. And so it's based on the average minimum temperature that we're going to see in a given year. And so here in Michigan, most of lower Michigan would be classified as USD hardiness zone 5. Okay, and that's based on our average low temperatures. There's some areas around southeast Michigan and Detroit where it's actually a little bit warmer at zone 6, and then a little belt along the lake shore that gets some temperature modification that would be zone 6 as well. But understanding that is important. Usually if you go to a garden center around here, they're only going to stock plants that are probably going to be within our hardiness zone. But we know that people nowadays are getting trees, mail order and online and things like that. So make sure you understand what your hardiness zone is. If you go to that USD hardiness zone map or that site, in fact, you can put in your zip code and it will tell you exactly what your hardiness zone is. Because if you, for example, are in zone 5 and you get plants that are only hardy to zone 7, which is quite a bit warmer, you're going to find out that in certain winters, those plants aren't going to make it out, right? So it's sort of the starting point. You want to make sure the plants can make it through the winter. Otherwise, they're kind of a non-starter. So understand your hardiness zone. And then the other side of it, certainly the high temperature end of things, we need to pay attention as well. And usually things that are hardy for our area, they're going to be able to withstand our summer temperatures. But, exposure, certainly if you are on the south side of a building, you can get reflected load. That can add to the tree's stress as well.
When we talk about right tree, right place, the next thing that usually comes up is plant it right. So what do you mean by planting it right?
Yeah, so it really depends on the type of tree you're talking about. So we have different, what we call stock types. So usually when we get trees for the landscape, if you go to a garden center, typically they're going to either be in containers or they're going to be in a root ball, balled and burlap. So that's a plant that's been dug from the field with the roots intact, with the soil intact, and then wrapped with burlap and then usually a wire basket placed around it. And so for both those, the biggest thing is making sure that we're planting at the right depth. A big mistake that people tend to make is planting things too deep. And what we want to do is when we plant things is to have what we call the root flare. So if you look at the trunk of a tree, it's pretty straight. And you can't see my hands, but I'm waving straight up and down here. But when you get down to where the roots start, there's a little shoulder where that root begins to flare out. And that's what we call the root flare. And what we really like to see is that root flare be right at grade or right at the top level of the soil. And so for both container grown trees and for trees that are in the balled and burlap situation, what can happen is either the media, if it's a container tree, or soil, if it's a balled and burlap tree, can often get piled up around the base of that trunk. And so if we just, say for a balled and burlap tree, if we just plant that soil in that ball, even with the level of our planting hole of our soil, in fact, that tree may end up being too deep. So we want to go in, and if you are planting a balled and burlap tree, take off the top of that burlap, actually get in there gently and carefully, excavate that soil and see if you can find that root flare. And you may have to go down a bit, because in the digging process and some of the things that have gone on in getting that tree into that balled and burlap situation, there can be soil that gets piled up around there. So take the time, find that root flare, and then that's where how deep the tree should be planted. So get that root flare at the grade. And important because if you dig your hole too deep, and even if you backfill, oftentimes the tree will tend to settle. So as you're digging, it's good to kind of go through and dig it incrementally, and so that you're sure not to get that hole too deep before you plant that tree.
Right. We often get questions about watering. How much should I water? And you hear people saying, I watered it every day, I watered it twice a week. What information can you give us about watering after it's planted?
Yeah, really, immediately after planting, certainly a good long soak, get it in there and help it to settle in as well. Probably, if anything, I think there's a tendency for people to overwater. I think if you look at, rainfall patterns and so forth, if we get about 1 inch of water a week, that's probably adequate. So if we got 1 inch of rain every week throughout the summer, most of our trees would be pretty satisfied. So that's kind of a rule of thumb. And you can look at it in terms of probably 1 or 2 waterings a week is adequate. Trying to water more often than that probably is more effort than it's worth.
Hey, Bert, those people who know you know you're a conifer aficionado. So what can you tell us about dwarf and unusual conifers?
Yeah, so that's an area that a lot of people are getting excited about. So people get into various things. There are people that are into roses, people that are into hostas, people that are into orchids. But there is a group of people out there that are what we call cone heads, or people that are really into conifers, and I fall in that category. So lots we can do there. I don't think people often realize the variation that's out there with conifers, the colors, the textures, the sizes, all the things that go on out there. So I really encourage people, if you've not had a chance to get exposed to some of this, we have a great resource here in the WJR listening area. If you go to Hidden Lake Gardens, so it would be west from the Detroit area, south from where I'm at right now, and so down not too far from the racetrack. If people know MIS and the Brooklyn area down there, there's a Hidden Lake Gardens, and it contains a world-class conifer collection. So Chubb Harper was a benefactor to Michigan State University, donated about 500 rare and unusual dwarf conifers to MSU, and they're on display at Hidden Lake Gardens. As I said, it's a world-class collection. If people are into plants and gardening and have not ever been there, it's certainly worth a trip. And in that collection, there are conifers that weep and creep and do everything you can imagine. You've got blue ones, yellow ones, green ones, anything you can imagine. And so it's really a fascinating thing to look at, both from a botanic standpoint. The botany of these things is fascinating, as well as just the design and the kind of things that people can do without annuals, without anything else, just with these conifers.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at a plant tag and it says dwarf conifer, and you go down to Hidden Lakes and see that same plant and see that it's towering over everything else. it lends the question of what does dwarf really mean when it comes to these conifers.
Yeah, so the American Conifer Society is sort of the organizing body for this, and they actually group conifers into different size classes. So they go all the way to miniatures. So the miniatures are truly that. So these are plants that would grow less than an inch a year. So you could have a miniature conifer that could be 20 years old that might only be 2 feet tall. Right, so this is kind of a specialty thing, maybe a rock garden. A lot of people nowadays are getting into what they call railway gardenings. So they use the G-scale railroads, and then we'll actually use these miniature conifers as the landscape pieces around these railroad gardens. Really cool stuff if you're into that. So maybe they can join the hobbies. The guy is into the model trains and the wife's into the conifers, and you can pull these together. And then dwarf would be 1 inch to 6 inches a year, which dwarf Alberta spruce would probably be one that many people are familiar with, and it's sort of the gateway drug oftentimes for the conifer syndrome. And then there are intermediates, which are 6 inches to a foot a year, and then there are the full-size conifers, which would be greater than a foot a year. So when you look at these tags, if you get into these conifers, that's how these are organized, and so that's the size class that these. So even a dwarf, well, if you say 6 inches a year, well, if it's 20 years old, it could still be a 10-foot tall tree. So they do grow. It's just they're growing slower than, say, a normal white pine or Norway spruce or something else that people might be familiar with.
There are a number of garden centers who carry these dwarf and exotic conifers. Are there any specific places that come to mind, that come to your mind in terms of looking for these unusuals?
Yeah, and again, not to endorse anybody or exclude anybody else, but certainly Wiegand's, right? Wiegand's Nursery has a wide selection of some unusual conifers. There's certainly things that you wouldn't find at, say, a big box store kind of thing. It would be one good place to look for folks in the Metro Detroit area. Also, I would say certainly if you're really looking for the rare and unusual stuff, G Farm. So Gary G has been a long time supporter of Hidden Lake Gardens, so the conifer collection down there. And in fact, he propagates a lot of his own material, and he has a very interesting arboretum. So people that are really into conifers and like to see different things, if you go to G Farms, I don't know if I should tell people this on the radio or not, but ask if you can see their arboretum. It's right across the road from their garden center, and he has things that literally you will not find anyplace else that you can look at. And then, of course, their selection, he has things that he's propagated himself that you won't find other places.
Okay, sounds good. We need to take another short break, and we'll come back with more PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show on News Talk 760 WJR. Welcome back. We're here with Dr. Bert Cregg from the Departments of Horticulture and Forestry at Michigan State University, and we've been talking about trees. Bert, there's a lot of questions about spruce, and I know you're really pretty involved with spruce decline. Can you give the listeners an overview of what spruce decline is and if there's anything they can do about it?
Yeah, so spruce decline is really a complex, if you will. It's several different things that are going on with spruce trees at the same time. So when we look, and we're talking particularly now about blue spruce. So what happens with blue spruce, first of all, we need to understand, Colorado blue spruce, if we're going to use kind of the full common name with it, is native to arid areas of the Rocky Mountains. Okay, obviously here in Michigan, we have a much more humid climate, and because of this, we tend to have a lot of issues with fungal pathogens, and there's several different ones that can affect blue spruce trees. In particular, there are needle casts. Rhizosphaera needle casts in particular is one that will affect new needles as they emerge. It infects the new needles as they come out each spring, but then the needles are killed off the following year. And so what happens oftentimes is you have this sort of shell with the new needles, and then the tree is bare underneath that. So that's one thing that's going on and can often lead to problems. The other thing that can happen is we have some canker issues. So these are branch cankers that can form. There's a couple different pathogens that can cause this. And this is oftentimes when you see a blue spruce tree and you see a dead branch here, a dead branch there, and then this often progresses sometimes from the bottom of the tree up, or sometimes they can just be random within the tree. And so because of this, and these are widespread issues, it can really lead to a lot of problems with blue spruce trees, especially as the trees get older. So oftentimes, maybe we plant the tree, it's 6-8 feet tall, looks great for 8-10 years, and then as the trees get bigger, we notice these things as the tree starts to decline. The challenge is there's really limited options to dealing with it. So first of all, if it's just a needle cast, there are some fungicides that homeowners can use to treat the needle. So basically what you're doing, they're preventative sprays. And so you would get a professional arborist out. They need to spray them a couple of times in the spring, and you can actually prevent the new infections from occurring. And then over time, the tree will begin to fill back in. Okay. So first of all, you need to confirm that the needle cast is the problem, and that can be done by sending samples to the MSU diagnostic lab. They can do this, or a professional arborist can help make that determination for you. So if that's all you've got going on, there is some potential for addressing that. If it's more of the branch canker thing going on, those are more difficult to treat. With fungicides, really they're not curative. It's difficult to eliminate an infection once it's occurred. Like for the needle cast, we can prevent it. But once these trees begin to decline, it's really tough to deal with in terms of fungicide treatments. If it's the branch cankers and these branches are starting to die back, especially if they're going from the bottom up, then your best course of action is really to prune off those infected limbs, as they're starting to decline.
Yeah, and it really goes back to right plant, right place, because over the years, all of us have been called out to different project sites to do some diagnostics. And we found that one of the things when you can tell a blue spruce is stressed is that it tends to lose some of its blue color on the tips. And so once you see that off color, green, blue, you know that the plant needs some help.
Yeah, exactly. And again, back to the right tree, right place, as you said, oftentimes in shaded areas. So blue spruce really need full sunlight, and having good air circulation is also important. So oftentimes we see these trees, especially where they're shaded, they'll decline even faster.
How about fertilization? Is there anything a listener can do in terms of helping the tree along?
It might, again, sort of forestall things, improve the vigor of the new growth, so that, especially if you are in a situation where it's primarily the needle cast is the issue, you might be able to kind of forestall things a little bit if you can get it on a fungicide program where you're preventing the new infections that the needles continue to develop. Then perhaps fertilization would help. I probably would base that off of a soil test first, make sure that that's really a nutrient limiting site, rather than just start a blanket fertilization program. But it's really forestalling the inevitable. One thing, I've got a book here on my shelf. It's actually Liberty Hyde Bailey wrote a book in 1933 on cultivated conifers, and in that book he talks about the issues with blue spruce. So what are we talking about? 90 years. Okay, so as long as we've had spruces, blue spruces here in Michigan, they've had issues. And so a lot of this really gets back to, these are fungal diseases, and it's really the fact that our sites are more humid than what that plant has been adapted to, and it's really a challenge to keep them going.
Yeah. What are some of the other evergreen trees that you have favor with?
Yeah, so one of the things we're really encouraging people is to look at alternatives to blue spruce. I actually have a bulletin if people want to Google, just put in MSU and alternatives to blue spruce. So there are some things out there. I wouldn't overlook the obvious. So some things like white spruce is a Michigan native. Maybe doesn't have the blue color and everything, but it's really a tough as nails type of plant, can handle even some poor drainage. So really, especially if you're looking for a screening kind of element, white spruce, I wouldn't overlook that. Also, Black Hill spruce, which is really a form of white spruce, slightly slower growing, but is really nice form. So don't overlook that. Serbian spruce is one that we're seeing more and more in the landscape, and that's a good growing spruce tree. Has kind of a silvery underside to the needles, a nice look. Concolor fir. So this is one we're actually moving out of spruces now and into firs. And most firs we tend to think of as sort of, prima donnas, and people might be familiar with Fraser fir if they have that as a Christmas tree. And we typically think of firs as, they need, acidic soil, well drained and all this. But actually concolor fir is a fir tree that will tolerate a little bit poorer drainage than some other firs. A lot of sites where we might have planted a blue spruce in the past can have really blue color. There are concolor firs that can be as blue as a blue spruce. So that's a good alternative as well.
Any pines come to mind?
Yeah. Well, even white pine, depending on the situation. Now, make sure one thing we didn't talk about in right tree, right place is room to grow. And that's a mistake people often make is planting trees too close to the house. You bring this thing home and it's been in a nursery. Maybe it's been sheared or pruned to look like a Christmas tree, 6-8 foot tall tree. But remember, with white pine and also Norway spruce, I would put in this category. These are trees I often recommend as screens because they will grow really, really fast once they're established. So with the white pine is a good tree in a lot of situations, but 3 feet a year for a well-established white pine is not unusual. Same thing with Norway spruce. So make sure that if you do plant these large conifers that you're giving them room to grow. And it's easy to make the mistake, and I've done it myself. I've got a tree, a Dawn redwood at home that I planted about 8 feet from my garage. It's about ready to eat my garage.
It's funny. Well, anyway, Bert, great. It was great having you today, and thanks for the useful information that you shared with our listeners. If you have any questions for Bert Cregg, visit plantmichigangreen.com and submit your questions to Ask the Expert. All right, stay tuned for more of plantmichigangreen.com Gardening Show after this short break on 760 WJR.
Now back to more gardening with your host, Dr. Bob Shutzke, on the plantmichigangreen.com Gardening Show. Here's Dr. Bob.
I'd like to continue our conversation about trees and add a few thoughts about energy conservation and the impact trees have on microclimates. Okay, trees impact microclimates in many ways. They provide shade and reflect solar radiation, actually decreasing surface temperatures at times. Deciduous trees block 60 to 90% of the solar radiation during the summer, and air temperature under trees in the summer can be 8 to 12 degrees cooler than in the sunlight. So planting deciduous or evergreen trees on the west or south side of buildings controls summer heat gain. The deciduous trees planted on the south side of a building should be located far enough away so they don't block the winter sun, but close enough to the buildings so they can provide adequate shade. The economic impacts of tree shading are immense. Studies show that trees planted next to buildings can reduce cooling costs from 15 to 75%. Shading an air conditioning unit can save up to 10% on cooling costs, and that's important. Many of us have air conditioning units outside the house, and putting not only trees but shrubs around them can increase the efficiency of those air conditioning units. Conversely, when the sun is allowed to strike the south side of buildings during the winter, the heating seasons, 30% of the interior space heating needs can be met. So there's benefits both in the summer in terms of the shade and in the winter in terms of benefits in heating. Trees also cool and humidify microclimates through evapotranspiration. Plants secrete water vapor from the leaves and stems as part of photosynthesis. A large tree can transpire up to 200 gallons of water per day, and some trees remove more than their weight in water from the soil each day. Solar energy converts this water into water vapor, as well as water that collects on the surface of the plants and the ground. The conversion of liquid water to water vapor removes heat from the atmosphere and results in a cooling effect. An abundance of trees planted in urban areas can reduce ambient temperature by 5 degrees through evapotranspiration alone. And you often experience this when you're out in a park situation or downtown shopping district. When you come underneath the canopy of trees, there's often a difference in the atmosphere. The additional impact of trees have on microclimate is that they block wind and precipitation. Existing and introduced trees can create wind ramps and windbreaks, a means to deflect cold winter wind. A wind ramp is created by placing increasingly taller evergreen plants in a grouping so they direct the wind up over a structure. Windbreaks consist of one or more rows of trees or shrubs planted along property boundaries or other strategic location. Wind ramps and windbreaks also reduce heat loss from buildings in winter and decrease cooling costs in summer. A study in South Dakota evaluating linear windbreaks demonstrated that wind-deflected plantings reduce residential winter heating costs by 25%. When windbreaks were extended from one side of the building to 3 sides, the winter fuel savings jumped up to 40%. And this is important for us even in suburban areas. If we can deflect wind from the prevailing areas, which usually is the north to northwest direction, we will have a positive impact on our heating and cooling. So if you're interested in planting, consider the energy conservation benefits that trees can provide by just planting them in the right place. So that's it for this week. So don't forget to visit our website, plantmichigangreen.com, and click on Ask the Expert to submit your landscape and gardening questions. You may hear your question on the air. And if you have any questions for Bert Cregg on the information he presented today, go on to plantmichigangreen.com and then we will get those answers for you. And remember to tune in every Saturday at 4 p.m. through August for the best information and advice to maximize your outdoor living experience. And during the week, log on to plantmichigangreen.com, your landscaping and horticulture resource, to find a professional, a retail garden center, pose your gardening questions, or explore rewarding careers in the green industry. That's all for this week. I'm Dr. Bob, wishing you sunshine and happy gardening. Given the rain that we had lately, I will hold off on wishing you any rain. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll talk again.
You've been listening to the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show with Dr. Bob Shutzke, presented by the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association.